Well, my theme for this month has been gratitude. And one of the things that I am most grateful for at Thanksgiving as families get together is for the stories that get told. When families get together and they remember all of the things that have happened over the years, and it's almost impossible to get together with family and friends and not begin to tell stories about past years, and then to have things happen that you add to the lore become part of future stories. Wednesday, on Thanksgiving, we had our two children over. Mary and I had our two children over, their spouses, and then our in-law, their parents, on Thursday, and had a good time. On Thursday, though, our sink faucet burst. So that will become part of the lore of future Thanksgivings. And on Wednesday, Mary Ann was off from work, and we were both working in the kitchen, and she was making pie crusts at the time, and I was making turkey stock so I could make gravy. And I was working at the stove, and she was on the counter, and then I moved my stock pot into the sink so that I could begin to strain out the things that were in there and just get a broth. And while I was doing that, Mary Ann said to me, "Will you take this pie crust out to the freezer?" And so I turned around and I grabbed the pie crust and I took it and I walked out to the freezer, and I came back in from the garage. We have a freezer out in our garage. And to find Mary Ann standing over the sink washing her hands above my stock pot. I didn't react as quietly. That will be another story that will be part of future lore. And when I think about these kind of gatherings and stories, I really think, when I think about the Bible, I think the same thing. The stories that are in the Bible were the stories that, the memorable stories that were told down through the years. And they were just the ones that stuck and that were told year in and year out, year after year, and that were embellished as time went on and changed to meet circumstances. And I have the same kind of appreciation for those stories, although, as we talk about here often, we know that the way some of those stories were told didn't happen that way. And we've also come to appreciate over the years that some of the stories that were told down through the years and the centuries are stories that we would not choose to tell now because of the violence that were involved and the association with God with that violence. And so there's a kind of an education that happens over the years as you tell those stories, and as you grow up as an adult and you learn more of the truth about the stories. And for me, I have found that to be very enlightening and sometimes shocking. And I have to say that, as Christmas comes and we begin to tell the stories of Jesus' birth again, there's nothing about that keeps me knowing the truth about those stories, what I know about the truth of those stories. There's nothing about that keeps me from being able to enter into the Christmas season and not fully appreciate the stories and celebrate what they mean in terms of their history and in terms of the mythic quality that they have and the hopes that are represented there. And I'm going to be talking more about that in the next few weeks as we get into Advent. And I have much the same feeling about Thanksgiving and the stories that are told about Thanksgiving in our country. I don't know. I mean, I'm far removed now as an adult and now as a parent whose kids aren't in school anymore from what kids learn about Thanksgiving in elementary school, whether they still do the pilgrim thing and they learn, they dress up as pilgrims. Do they still do that? probably. I hope they do. But it probably doesn't surprise you, and maybe you already know this, to know that what we learned about this story as children isn't quite the way things really happened. I read a really nice article the other day, it was a couple weeks ago, by a Jewish author. And he was actually talking about how he dreaded Christmas. And because he grew up in a Jewish family, and he went to school with his Christian friends, and he was never able to celebrate Christmas. And he always wanted his parents to bring a tree home, and they wouldn't let him bring a tree home. And they said the tree goes with Jesus. And we don't do Jesus, so we don't do the tree. And so he wanted to do it, but he couldn't do it. But then as he grew, he was talking about how he came to really see and embrace Thanksgiving as a really important religious holiday for our country. And what he was talking about was the fact that now in our country, when he looks around and he sees Muslims and he sees Jews, he sees Christians, he sees other religious faiths and people of no religious faith who all embrace the holiday and who all find a reason to come together with families and to give thanks, and how he really appreciates Thanksgiving. He did say, though, that there's one group that has a slightly different take on Thanksgiving than all the rest of these groups, and that would be those who come from a Native American heritage. And one of the other articles that I read, I want to read some for you today, is by a man by the name of Chuck Larson, who's a historian, a teacher, and a Native American, who's descended from some of the Native American tribes from the East. And I want to read some of his description of that first Thanksgiving and what it meant and what it means to him. And, I have a friend, Joe Mayer, who says to me that my role in life is to ruin the holidays for people. So, sorry if I'm ruining Thanksgiving. When the Pilgrims crossed the Atlantic Ocean in 1620, they landed on the rocky shores of a territory that was inhabited by the Wampanoag Indians. The Wampanoags were part of the Algonquin-speaking peoples, a large group that was part of the Eastern woodland culture. They lived in villages along the coast of what is now Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and they lived in round-roofed houses called wigwams. These were made of poles covered with flat sheets of elm or birch bark. And I'm not going to read this piece, but he does talk about before this that he thinks it's important to know, as he tells this story about the Native Americans and the way they greeted and welcomed the newcomers to this country, that the Native Americans themselves were not as they are often thought of. And he talks about his own tribes when the Americans began to come over from the old world to the new world, where it had been in a long, vicious war with other tribes. And so, there was that reality of a part of their life as well. The Wampanoags moved several times during each year in order to get food. In the spring, they would fish in the rivers for salmon and herring. In the planting season, they moved to the forest to hunt deer and other animals. After the end of the hunting season, people moved inland where there was greater protection from the weather. From December to April, they lived on food that they had stored during the earlier months. These Indians of the eastern woodlands called the turtle, the deer, and the fish their brothers. They respected the forest and everything in it as equals. Whenever a hunter made a kill, he was careful to leave behind some bones or meat as a spiritual offering to help other animals survive. Not to do so would be considered greedy. They also treated each other with respect. Any visitor to a Wampanoag home was provided with a share of whatever food the family had, even if the supply was low. The same courtesy was extended to the Pilgrims when they met. We can only guess what the Wampanoags must have thought when they first saw the strange ships of the Pilgrims arriving on their shores. But their custom was to help visitors, and they treated the newcomers with courtesy. It was mainly because of their kindness that the Pilgrims survived at all. The wheat the Pilgrims had brought with them to plant would not grow in the soil in the east. So they had to learn new ways in a new world. And the one man who helped them the most was called Squanto. I do remember some of the story from childhood. In 1605, 15 years before the Pilgrims came, Squanto had gone to England with a friendly English explorer named John Weymouth. And there he learned to speak English very well. He came back to New England with Captain Weymouth, and then later he was captured by a British slaver, and he was returned and sold into slavery, and then he was eventually freed by Weymouth. And he, there, in that time of slavery, met another Native American who also had learned to speak English, and they came back to the New World, and they were from near each other, although they had known each other before. They both came back to Patuxent in 1620. And when they came back to that village, which is actually the same spot where the Pilgrims came and landed, they found that their village was deserted and that everyone in their village, almost everyone in their village, had died from the diseases they had caught from the old world traders as they were coming over.